Today we are going to discuss about the risk identification and assessment program. So as I was mentioning, today we are going to discuss about risk identification and assessment. We have seen various kinds of risk. What are the risks to the information security? What are the risks to the privacy framework? Now we are going to see what is the framework associated with risk identification and the assessment. So we are going to see overall framework. What are the frameworks are available with us? How to treat those risks, how to assess the risk. The first point is how to identify the risk. First, we have identified the risk, then we will going to assess the risk, and accordingly, we are going to treat the risk. There would be a overall channel of risk identification and assessment. So today, the agenda of this risk assessment training session is that today we are going to identify what are the risks and the risk management processes, risk management life cycle, risk identification, the sources of risk, what are the risk assessment process, how to assess the risk assessment methodology also we are going to cover, along with method of the risk assessment, responsibilities, and couple of case studies we are going to discuss during this risk assessment exercise. Before going ahead, we need to identify what actually the risks are, to whom we are calling it as a risk. Risk, the definition of the risk, when we are going through the definition of the risk is an object, a person, or an entity that represent a danger, harm, or loss to asset. The risk can be your object, risk can be a person, a risk can be your entity also. The risk represent the danger, harm, loss, danger, harm, or a loss to the asset. Asset would be here your information assets. This is called as a risk. Now let's discuss about risk management. What actually the risk management? Risk management is a process of identifying, assessing, and evaluating the level of risk facing the organization, especially the threats to the information stored and using by organization for achieving business objectives. This would be an overall process of identifying, assessing, evaluating, and you can say controlling the risk by having appropriate control. This would be a process. The overall process is called as risk management. Risk life cycle, as you can see here, this is the overall risk life cycle. Risk would be there when there would be vulnerability. Vulnerability can be exploited by the threat agent. Let's start from here. Threat agent would be there. Threat agent, what threat agent will do? Threat agent will exploit the vulnerability. When the vulnerability has been exploited by the threat agent, then it leads to a risk. When risk would be there, when risk will happen, it can damage your assets, and also it would result in an exposure of your information assets. So when we do have exposures or a risk, then it should be properly protected. This is called as a safeguard. This is a total life cycle of the risk. It will start from identifying your threat. What could be the threat to your system? Then vulnerability identification. What is the vulnerability within your system? Then when a threat exploits the vulnerability, it would result in a risk. Risk would damage the assets, or it will expose you over the various channel. And once we will have all these, then it should be have a countermeasure which is called as a safeguarding mechanism. So this is the total overall risk life cycle. Let's understand it through a chart itself. We need to first identify the risk, then assess the risk, and define the desired result. Select the strategy. Strategy will come under the selection of your controls. What are the controls we need to implement? We need to implement a strategy. Accordingly, we will need to monitor the things, and after monitoring the things, we need to evaluate and adjust the things. So this would be comes under your risk control. This would be a overall organized process, each step output considered as the input for the next step. So this would be a proper uh, risk identification process. If you know risk management, how we are going to manage our risk, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not to fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in the battle. So this has been said by Sanju. Now let's start the first phase. First phase of the risk is your risk identification. The purpose of this phase to identify, classify, prioritize the organizational information assets and identify all important types of sources of the risk and uncertain know or enemy associated with each of investment objective. In the risk identification, first what we are going to do, we are going to identify our assets, and based upon the identification of our assets, we are going to identify, classify, and the prioritize the organization information asset. So this would comes under the risk identification. So this is a crucial phase. If a risk not identified, it cannot be evaluated or managed. So this is risk identification is a very crucial phase. If the risk could not be identified, it could not be also managed. We need to focus upon the risk identification because this is the first step toward the risk. Let's this is the information assets, information security components. It is the overall structure of your information assets what we do have. The first thing is your information component. In the information component, there are various parts maybe there in the organization, your people, your procedure, your data, softwares and hardware. It will consider as an information component. People is also your information assets, or you can say they are also your assets. There are two employees would be there, non-employee would be there. In the employee, your authorized staffs would be there, and other staffs would be there. Non-employee means your contractors and all would be there. Your strangers are there. People are trusted organization would be there. All those comes under these things. When talking about the procedure, we do have a standard procedure in the organization. Sensitive data handling procedure would be also there. Data, there are various types of data we do have. The data which is under transmission, the process related data, the storage will have a lots of data. In the same way, software components, your application would be there, OS would be there, some security related components would be there. In hardware, your system devices and the network would also be a part of your information security asset. This would be your information. The first phase of risk management is the risk identification. Before identifying the risk, we should know our information assets. What are the information assets we do have in the organization? These are the process of information assets. Once we know our information assets, then we need to know what would be the risk. What would be the risk to the primary risk sources would be there. The primary risk source would be the flood, earthquake, and hurricanes. This would be your would be also your risk sources. outside and natural threats would be there as your risk source. Some environmental related things would be also there. Environmental related threats would be there. Uh, some power failures and pollution related threat would be there. Network based attack, virus infection, and unauthorized access types of human related threats would also be there. These are the certain examples of human related, uh, uh, you can say, examples of your primary sources of the risk item. Risk assessment for each identified component and the risk which has clearly significant or possibly significant positions, each should be assessed to establish quality and the estimate the value. This is called as a risk assessment. What actually the risk assessment are? Assessing the risk is the process of determining the likelihood of the threat being exercised against the voluntary and the resulting impact from a successful compromise. Determine the relative risk for each vulnerability. So in the risk assessment, what we are going to do, we are going to, first thing is going to identify our assets, the threats, what are the threats to the assets. Based upon the threats, we are going to identify the likelihood of the threat being exercised against the vulnerability. A threat, the probability of threat has exploited the vulnerability. The first thing we are going to identify, and another thing we are going to identify what would be the impact from a successful compromise. If there would be a successful compromise, what would be the impact? In the risk assessment, the first thing is to identification of your assets. Once you have identified the asset, then you need to identify what are the threats and what are the vulnerability in the system. Now this would be the first part. Another part would be your, another part would be, another part is to determine the likelihood, of the threat that being exercised against the vulnerability, or you can say in a simple word that what would be the likelihood and what would be the probability when a threat will exploit the vulnerability within your system. This is called as a likelihood. Another thing is to find out is the impact. What is the impact? Impact is resulting from impact. What would be the result from a successful compromise? When a successful compromise would be there, what would be the result? What would be the impact on the system? This is called this total thing is called as risk, assessing the risk. This is the process of assessing the risk. In the risk assessment, we used to assign a risk rating, or you can say score, for each specific assets useful in evaluating the relative risk and the making the comparative rating later in the risk control process. So here we are going to do risk assessment. This risk assessment would be a quantitative risk assessment, not a qualitative one. In the quantitative risk assessment, we are going to assign each and ratings or score, you can say, for each and specific assets. So there are two methods of risk assessment. The first method is the quantitative risk assessment. In the quantitative risk assessment, what we are going to do, we are generally estimate the value of information system component as what would be the component? Your information system, business processes, and the recovery cost. This would be your quantitative risk assessment. The risk can be measured in terms of direct or indirect cost. You are going to measure the risk in terms of whether it direct or indirect cost based upon the likelihood that damaging event will occur, the cost of potential losses, the cost of mitigating action that could be taken. This is the quantitative risk where we are going to provide the score, and based upon the score, we are going to assess the risk. Another risk is your qualitative risk. This approach can be taken by defining this risk is your subjective. This risk assessment approach will be subjective. You will use general terms like this high, medium, or low. You will say this risk, this is very high risk, this is very low risk, this is very medium risk. In this, you are not going to conduct the assessment. In the qualitative assessment, depend more on the expertise, experience, and the judgment of those conducting the assessment. So this would be totally depend upon the person's experience who is conducting the risk assessment. Qualitative risk assessment typically given in the risk result like high, moderate, and low. Whether you will say that this is very high risk. Let's take an example of password. Suppose you have certain password. You are using simple password. You are not using the complex password. Then the chance of you can say data compromise or data breach would be high. So you will say that this would be a high risk. When you are going to say this is a high risk, this would be a qualitative types of risk. You have not done any quantitative approach. You have not how much it will impact, because when we are talking about the quantitative approach, this would have certain things that how much it is going to result to organization. What would be whether the impact will be the financially, if it would be result financially, how much dollars or how much uh, uh, we are going to lose if this risk has been occurred. In the same way, when you are talking about the qualitative risk, in the qualitative risk, only high, medium, low with the category, you will say that this is a high priority risk. You need to cure it. But what would be the impact to the organization in terms of value and all? We are not going to know. So this is difference between qualitative and quantitative risk approach. Now, how to assess the risk? Risk assess by following step. We are going to use the following steps to assess the risk. The first thing is to identify the threat. Then we need to identify the vulnerability. The third thing is the relating threats to the vulnerability, whether the threat is related to the vulnerability or not. Then we are going to determine the likelihood, and then we are going to identify the impact. This would be a channel of risk assessment. Identify your threat, identify your vulnerability, determine the likelihood that a threat will exploit the vulnerability, and the impact what would be the impact on the organization. The first thing in the risk assessment start from your asset identification. Asset identification shall be performed at a suitable level of detail that provides sufficient information for a risk assessment. So first we need to identify the assets. Then we need to identify the asset owner. Who is the asset owner? The third thing, we are going to identify the review boundary, the parameter of the assets, whether the assets are in the organization or asset would not be in the organization. What is the appropriate risk associated with that? Then the first we need to identify the assets. Once we have identified our assets, then we need to go for the asset classification. What are the assets we do have in the organization? This asset classification is given in ISO 27005. Our asset classification would be your physical assets, your people related assets, the software related assets, your service related assets, and the information assets. This would be the overall category of assets category. So first we need to identify our asset. Then we need to categorize our assets. What would be the category of the asset? In physical assets, when we are talking about the physical assets, your computer, desktop, server, firewall, printers, mobile, communication devices, equipment, etc. will come under the physical devices. When we are talking about the people related thing, in the people related, employees, employees will come in the people assets. When you are talking about the people, then contractor, vendors, partners would come under your people related assets. The third thing is the software assets. You need to identify the software assets. In the software asset, your operating system, your utility software, all things would come under the software assets. Services, you are giving certain services to a customer, all those would be part of your services. Information, your information related to the processes, policies, guidelines, all things would comes under the information related asset. So this would be overall category of information asset. Now, the the first thing will start from your asset identification. Then you have done asset classification. Now we'll go toward the value of the asset. We need to identify what is the value of the asset. We need to identify the value of asset in terms of C, I, and A. C is your confidentiality, I is your integrity, and A is your availability. Here we can use a scale of 1 to 3 scale. We can use the three factors shall be considered on a scale of 1 to 3. This confidentiality, integrity, and availability we are going to use on a factor of 1 to 3. 1 would be the least vulnerable and 3 would be the most vulnerable. The asset value would be your C plus I plus A. Confidentiality plus integrity plus availability of assets. You need to use 3 by 3 matrix here. In the we are going to give number 1, 2, 3. 1 would be your less vulnerable and 3 would be your most vulnerable. So what this would result in asset value. This would result in asset value. Now when we are talking about C plus I plus A, 3 is the most. 3 plus 3 plus 9. 3 result in 9. So this would be the highest asset value. In the same way, talking about the lowest asset value would be your 1 plus 1 plus 1. This is C, I, and A. This is called as asset value. This is called as asset value. This is the method how to calculate the asset value. We'll see. We'll prepare one of the asset register. We'll see there. To whom we are calling as 1, 2, 3. Here is the category has been provided. Because we are using the quantitative approach, so we need to provide this one 1, 2, 3. This you can see confidentiality. Category low, we are going to provide 1 rating to all the public information. Private information within the organization will be given as 2 rating. Confidential information would be given at 3 ratings. Suppose you are handling any confidential information. Suppose your asset, we have identified a asset like project report. Project report is your one of the asset. The confidentiality of the information is very high. In that case, C would be 3. In that case, also asset will be integrity. Integrity is also been categorized into 3 parts: low, medium, and high. For negligence or not critical effect on operation, we can give it 1. Correctness of the asset or the process method are crucial to the business process where we cannot afford any error. This could result in 3. In the project plan also we cannot afford any error. It will be 3. Availability also, project plan should be readily available to each and every employee. To the not each and every employee, authorized people when it is required. Then its availability would be also high. Availability we have categorized into 3 parts: 1, 2, 3. Also, high is the critical one because outage more than 1 hour is not accepted. In the same case, you can see the asset value will result in 9. That means higher the asset value, that means your asset is very critical to you. So this is the method how to identify the asset value. Let's take some of the examples of asset value. Threat, high user knowledge of internal employee, high user and the knowledge of internal employee, external critical documents shared on a network, natural calamities, lack of documentation, lack of physical security guard etc. Vulnerability is your virus attack, lack of documentation, inadequate access control and all. These are the vulnerabilities in the system. Or also you don't have proper diesel generators oil, you know. Now asset value is the value of the confidentiality plus value of integrity plus value of availability. Then threat is very high, vulnerability are also there in the system, availability of data should be there because there are lots of vulnerability in the system. Based upon that we can calculate the asset value 3 plus 3 plus 3 because everything is high. Then we can calculate the value 3 plus 3 plus 3. Your asset value will come to the 9. So this is the way to identify the asset value. Now, how to identify the risk? There are various risks to a system, like act of God is your risk, external attacks are the risk, external failures, internal attacks, internal misuse of your data and services. These are all called as the risk. Now, we need to identify the vulnerabilities in the system. Identify vulnerability in the system, how each of the threat that are possible or likely could be perpetrated, and the list to the organization asset and their vulnerability. Vulnerability can be identified by the numerous ways. Vulnerabilities can be identified by doing the vulnerability scan. Some of the commonly identified vulnerabilities has been given in ISO 27005 standard. The certain vulnerability would be the common in each and every organization. A specific vulnerability can be found by using various tools and techniques. Like we can have various tools for identifying the vulnerability in the system. Suppose I want to identify vulnerability in my website, I will go for a security scan of the websites. If we are talking about the vulnerability in your file server or any of the server, in that case I will go and scan the number of open ports are there in the systems and all. These are the method of identifying the vulnerability. We'll see in the next sessions also how to identify the vulnerability by using various tools. So here we need to identify the vulnerability, related vulnerability in the system. Based upon the identifying the vulnerability, we need to give a rating, because we have identified our assets, we had identified the risk, we have also identified the vulnerability in the system. Threat has been also identified. Now likelihood, what actually the likelihood? Likelihood is that estimation of the probability. It is the estimation of the probability that a threat will succeed in achieving the undesirable event, or you can say estimation of the probability when a threat will exploit the vulnerability, whether the threat is going to exploit the vulnerability or not. This is called as likelihood. Likelihood is your, there are 1 to 5 rating. Now we can use 1 to 3 also, 1 to 5 rating also is there. Likelihood is your 1, we are calling it as a rare, and 5 is almost certain. Almost certain that it is very probable that it will happen once in a month, once in a year and all, once in a month itself. Rare, which will impossible to occur, the certain threats will not going to occur. This is called as a rare. Unlikely, it could occur 1 to 2 times in a year. Possible that it will occur 2 to 3 times in a year. Likely rating we are going to give to the probability that it will happen 5 to 6 times in a year. This would be sample likelihood definitions. Sample likelihood definitions that we have 1 to 5 we are using. 1 is very rare and 5 is almost certain. When it is not likely to happen or impossible to happen, it is rare. will give the 1 rating. If certain things is going to happen very frequently, then almost certain 5 rating would be given. So this is the likelihood. In the same case, impact, when we have identified the likelihood, then we need to also identify the impact. Impact would be your 1 to 5. 1 would be your negligible and 5 would be your most. When it is not going to happen, then when the impact would be very negligible to the organization, then it is called as negligible. Or when it is going to happen, major breakdown to our IT system assets, or major breakdown would be there, major impact would be there, then it would be called, we are going to give as rating 5. This is the scale of 1 to 5 what we are also going to use. Then we have identified the asset value. We have also identified the threat likelihood and the threat consequences also. Now we need to identify the risk value. What is the risk value? Risk value would be your multiplication of the asset value, C plus I plus A would be your asset value. Likelihood 1 to 5 scale what we have identified, and the consequences what we have identified 1 to 5 scale rating also we have identified. It will be the multiplication of asset value, likelihood, and the consequences would result in the risk value. So here we comes to know what is the risk value, what are the risks we do have within your system. Now in the same way, now we have identified our risk, that these are the risk value we do have. Now what are the risk treatment option we do have? The risk treatment option would be your ATMA. You can call short form is your ATMA. The first thing is that we can avoid the risk. A is risk avoidance. Risk having priority value low or very low can be decided to avoid. This is called as a risk avoidance. Transfer, in the some cases, suppose we can transfer the risk. How we can transfer the risk? Like suppose we are taking the medical insurances. Because why we are taking the medical insurance? Because there are certain risks that we can get infected with several viruses and all, and we can get admitted in the hospitals. That's why we are taking the medical insurance. In that, the moment we have taken the medical insurances, we have transferred our financial risk to third party organization who is providing us the health insurance and so on. So this is called as a risk transfer. Another thing is your risk mitigation. In the mitigation, we are going to mitigate the risk and risk acceptance. The last thing is your risk acceptance. In the risk acceptance, we can accept the risk based upon the priority of the risk. We can accept the risk. We can take a decision, like your chief information security officer can take a decision to accept the risk, because those risks cannot have major impact to the organization. So normally risk mitigation, all the risks should be mitigated. Our focus would be on the risk mitigation itself. Avoidance, transfer, and acceptance would be very few. In few cases, we can accept the risk, or in few cases, we can transfer it. Like nowadays, organizations are taking cyber security insurance. The cyber security insurance has been taken to transfer the risk to the third party. If any case would be there, any case will happen in the organization could not be financially impacted. So there are various common risk assessment methodology are there, like your NIST, National Institute of Standard and Technology, is your one of the framework. Octave is also the risk management framework. FRAP is also the framework. COBRA and Risk Watch. These are the certain frameworks or methodology to identify the risk and to treat the risk. So this is the sample risk assessment methodology. Risk assessment activity, your identification of the system characteristic, you have identified your system, you have identified the threat, you have identified the vulnerability. This is the overall flowchart what we have seen till now. Asset identification, then threat identification, vulnerability identification. Next step would be the control analysis, whether it can be controlled or not. Your ATMA, what we have discussed, ATMA, whether risk can be avoided, treated, mitigated, or accepted. Then we need to go for likelihood or impact, then risk determination, then control, then we accordingly will go for the control and will document the result, the thing. So this would be total or overall risk assessment activity, what needs to do. Now, the major question is that who would do the risk assessment? A risk assessment is carried out by the team of people who have knowledge of the specific area of the business, because you or me or anyone in the organization may not have certain knowledge. In the terms of IT security, we do have certain knowledge, but certain we could not have knowledge related to HR processes or your infra related projects. So this would be a group of people who are going to play a role, like for some would be from the information security, some would be from the management team and all. So these would be going to play a very critical role. Now we are going to summarize the risk assessment practice and their related benefit. The processes what we are going to use, your identify the threat and likelihood, identify the rank, you need to estimate the damage, we need to come with the mitigation cost, and we need to document the asset finding. What are the tools we are going to use here? Tables, questionnaire, standard reporting format, some of the softwares like we can use for finding out the vulnerability, and lists of threats and controls. Once we will have all these things, this will result in benefit that your risk could be mitigated within the organization, increase the understanding of the risk, mechanism of reaching the consequences, and the communication, proper means of communication would be there, which will communicate to each and every stakeholder. This would be a benefit of your risk assessment methodology. Now we'll go through a case study. This is a regulatory organization. Organizational objective in its risk management plan are to face any risk concerned with the loss of customer confidence, as well as monetary and productivity loss. So they are very concerned about the loss of customer confidence and the financial impact also, and somewhere productivity losses also. Risk assessment have always been a part of doing business that leads to determine the level of risk associated with a business functions or a process in order to determine the applicable security control. The organization consists of your central office who and the regional office. Central office, what central office do? They issue organization-wide information security risk assessment guidelines and establish a minimum control requirement. This is the role of your central office. Regional office throughout the US, with who facilitate the process in its geography area and the individual business unit and are responsible for conducting the assessment. The organizational policy and guidelines require business unit to conduct the risk assessment at least once in a year. When a new business, or another thing is that they are going to conduct the risk assessment when a new business operation is established or when a significant operational changes are there, they are going to do the risk assessment. This is the case study. Now, you need to do the risk assessment. What is the approach? Determine the risk assessment scope. We need to first determine the risk assessment scope and establish the team. Then we need to evaluate the risk Then we need to rank the damages or the impact. Then we need to assign the risk label. This is the flow. What would you are going to do for the risk assessment? You need to determine the scope. Once you have determined the scope, then you will go to determine the threat. Then we are going to do the impact assessment. Then we are going to assign a risk level for each vulnerability. Then we are going to do the risk assessment. When we are going to do the risk assessment, based upon the risk assessment, we'll go and prepare the risk control plan. And based upon the risk control plan, we'll prepare and summarize our result, and we'll have a proper controls in place. This is the flow as a risk manager you can adopt in the organization. What are the conducting the document assessment? Area of the vulnerability. This is the area of vulnerability. What we have seen, because you need to conduct the risk assessment, you need to first identify the area. What are the types of damage would be there? Your like unauthorized access modification, or denial of degradation of service, non-delivery of misdelivery of the services. This would be a certain damage. What will the potential consequences? Financial loss, productivity loss, or loss to the customer confidence, because this is also one of the objective of the organization. So this is the process to determine the thing, to determine the risk identification and risk treatment. I will show you a risk register, because we have done these things. Now I will show you a proper risk register, how to identify the risk. Then it will have a clear quality to you also. This is the risk register, what we are talking about, what we have discussing earlier. This is the software, hardware, network. This is your asset type: software, hardware, network, human resource, your people related asset, the site and the organization related assets. Now, when identifying the risk, this is the asset evaluation. The first thing is to identify your assets. Then we need to identify the asset owner. Who would be the asset owner? Based upon these two things, we are going to identify the threat. What is the threat to the system? Once we have identified these things, then we are going, because these are the asset evaluation, then risk identification. We are in the risk identification, we are going to have confidentiality, integrity, and the availability value, what we have discussed, CIA value. Asset value would be your based upon your C plus I plus A. Then we are going to identifying the vulnerability in the system. What would be the vulnerability in the system? Based upon identifying the vulnerability in the system, we are going to identify likelihood and the consequences. What would be the likelihood and what would be the consequences to the risk? Based upon the things, we are going to identifying the risk value. Once we have identified the risk value, then we will categorize these things in a medium, minor, and the things. Then we are going to have a risk treatment plan. Now we are going to have a risk treatment plan. In a risk treatment plan, we'll have what are the controls we do have in place. Now let's take an example. One of the things, like here you can see we have identified your software assets. Asset owner would be your IT team and your tools and automation teams, what they are using for. What are the threats are there? What are the threats to the system? Like suppose one threat is your forging of the rights. People, whatever the rights has been provided to the user, they may forge that right. This would be your one of the risks. When you have identified the forging of rights as a threat, then based upon the threats, you will identify the C plus I plus A rating, confidentiality, integrity, and availability rating. When now the how critical the confidentiality of this tools is. If it will be critical, very critical, then it will be two. Integrity, you cannot compromise with the integrity, then it will also high. You can give it the rating 3. Availability, as per the rating which you have seen, 1 to 3, we can give the rating. Based upon that, this the asset value will come. After having the asset value, will identifying the vulnerability. Like you can see vulnerability identifying this case that Unprotected password. The password what we are using is unprotected. If unprotected passwords are there, then what is the likelihood that threat would exploit the vulnerability, and what would the impact on the organization? 1 to 5 matrix, what 1 to 5 matrix what we have used, based upon 1 to 5 matrix, we will give the likelihood, consequences, and the risk value. Based upon this, our risk will come. Now, when we have the risk, then we need to have a proper controls also. Control, what would be the control? Control would be that you will define a password policy in the system, and based upon defining the password policy, you will implement the password policy across all the tools in your system. So this would be a overall risk assessment exercise. Today we have seen what are the risks, what are the definitions are there. Then tomorrow we'll practice on various risk component, how to identify the risk, what are the tools we need to discuss in this is the overall theoretical class. Today we'll do the practical of this risk identification treatment, and you need to come up with a lots of risk. You need to identify the risk threats and vulnerability, lots of risk threats and vulnerability. So these are the things. These are the things are there to identify the risk. No, this is the spreadsheet. Some of the organization are using the automated version of these things. The automated version, you need to first identify your assets. So based upon the asset identification, you will put the threats, what are the threats should be there, what are the asset value will automatically would be calculated. So we are using the spreadsheet for the practical purpose. So we'll do the practical on this risk identification tomorrow. So that's all for the day.